So Courtney Smyth, you're very welcome to Crime World. I'm delighted to have you on. We're going to talk about a book that you've chose as part of our True Crime Book Club, and you chose When the Dogs Don't Bark by Angela Gallop. Can you tell us a little bit about why you picked that book to talk about?
I've read it 3 times, so safe to say I'm a big fan of this book. Professor Angela Gallop is a forensic scientist with over 40 years experience in the field. She started out, I think she was studying sea slugs initially, and then realised that wasn't a particularly lucrative venture. Saw an ad for a forensic analyst, I think it was a lab technician in forensic science services in the UK in the 70s, took this job and then started this tremendously incredible career solving crime, reopening cold cases and solving those, and setting up her own independent forensic science labs as well across the UK and internationally. I just think she's a fantastic person, and this book is absolutely incredibly written. It's so engaging. I've read it 3 times. So
yeah, it's a book that you are incredibly passionate about. Like when we kind of came up with the concept of doing the book club, your name was like top of the list. I was like, I know Courtney will have something absolutely stellar to talk about. And this was my first time ever reading this book. And I went through my wish list on Goodreads to see if it was there. And I had actually had it marked for ages. Like I've read a lot of forensic science books, and I've read, books by pathologists, etc. But I've actually never read a book quite like this. It is incredibly interesting. Even the title of the book, I suppose, one thing she talks about, and one of the key things she zones in on, is the idea of evidence. And the absence of evidence doesn't mean that there is no evidence there. And that's kind of where the title, When the Dogs Don't Bark, come from. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think it actually came from a Sherlock Holmes story, and not to spoil a 100-year-old story, but there is a particular one where Sherlock's conclusion is that, well, the dog didn't bark when the intruder came in, therefore it was the dog's owner that was the intruder. So that was who did the murder. And it's just this idea that if the expected outcome isn't making sense, so you've got evidence and it's not building a picture that makes sense, it means you've missed something. And that's kind of been her entire philosophy throughout her career, is you have to keep looking because the evidence is there. Because we know in forensics, Lockhardt's principle is like one of like the first things you ever learn if you even have a passing interest in forensics. And it's the idea that every touch leaves a trace. And that's her point as well, that maybe every touch does leave a trace. The trace is there. It's just a case of whether you have the technology to find it, the ability to find it, the knowledge to find it. But the answers are always there.
And she's done some incredible work. One of the ones that she did was, there was a case where she had found between 2 layers of paint on a door, a tiny little blood speck. And, that was an incredible breakthrough. And it was from there she ended up doing more work for the police.
Yeah, and it was incredible. They'd repainted the walls 2 times since the murder had happened. And she just knew that if it happened the way that everybody was saying it happened, the evidence had to be there. So she got somebody on her team to basically go through and like chip away these layers of paint until she found that blood sample, which is just, first of all, is an incredible amount of time and money to spend on something. But like she knew that answer was there. And I just find that fascinating that passion was there for her. Because something I think that comes up a lot in the book is that idea that so many things don't get solved because the money isn't there or the knowledge isn't there. For every case that comes up, the police have to actually spend money on tests and spend money on sending away samples. So it's not a case of just finding evidence and somebody will sort through it and find it. It's all very time consuming and costly. But her team and this she set up a company called Forensic Alliance. And that team were basically focused on looking at these things that other people maybe weren't giving the time
and energy to. Yeah. So it was like that was the case of Lynette White that she ended up solving. And I think it was in 1988. And there was 3 people as part of that case that they were called the Cardiff 3, and they ended up being exonerated because of the evidence that she was able to uncover as part of that. But that's not the only case she's worked on. She's worked on some very famous cases, Damilola Taylor, Stephen Lawrence, even Gareth Williams. And one thing that actually struck me was the fact that she worked on the case of the death of Princess Diana. And there was an operation that was set up to look at the conspiracy theories around her death. And she was able to obviously look into that. They looked at the car, the paint on the car, to see, if somebody was, if it was a paparazzi car that was driving the car. She was looking at whether or not Princess Diana was pregnant, if she was on contraceptives, all those kinds of things. And she did specifically say as well, like, of the cases that are out there nowadays, like obviously she's worked on a lot of cold cases, but of the cases that are there now, it's not always a case of people will get away with it, not because of the lack of technology, but it is because of the lack of funding behind it, which is it's kind of frustrating, isn't it, to know that there's probably a load of cases that you obsess over and think about a lot, but to know that it's just money and time that needs to be sorted.
Yeah, no, it's wild when you think about it, how many of these, especially like if you're interested in true crime and you listen to these podcasts or you read these books and you realize all these stories that you've heard all these details on, it's not that nobody's doing their jobs, it's that literally somebody's job at the top is to basically go, well, we can't dedicate the time to that, or we can't dedicate the funding to that, or, you know, we had the evidence originally, now there's a test available, but we don't have that evidence anymore. And it is just, it's very, it gives a very interesting insight, I think, into the things that make you kind of shout at the TV when you're watching a story, being like, why aren't they doing this? It's because they don't have the money to do it, or they didn't have the technology at the time, or the tests at the time.
What is one thing from the book? What is one case, I suppose, from the book that stood out to you as a piece of work that she did that kind of fascinated you or intrigued you a lot?
Probably the Rachel Nicholl case. So this was a truly horrible case. Rachel Nicholl was walking on Wimbledon Common in 1992 with her 2-year-old son, and she was stabbed 49 times in broad daylight, like truly horrible. But at a loss for concrete evidence at the time, because they didn't have ability to test. I think DNA became possible, like DNA testing became possible in the late 80s, but it took a really long time for that to roll out across the world. So they pointed fingers at a local man named Colin Stagg, who was known for walking his dog in the area. They didn't seem to have any concrete evidence other than they could place this man there roughly around the time. They brought in a criminal psychologist who built a profile, and they decided Colin Stagg fit that profile, and they set up a project called Operation Edzell, where they basically did a honey trap, where they got an undercover policewoman to go and engage in a relationship with this man in order to try elicit a confession from him, which they didn't get. So he got acquitted, and the case fell apart because they had nobody. And Professor Gallop's team were brought in some years later to reopen this cold case. And at that point, they were then able to isolate much smaller amounts of DNA. And so they staged a reconstruction, and they were able to see, so they got somebody to put on white overalls, and they reconstructed what they thought had happened in the case, and were able to see where would the perpetrator have touched Rachel, so that they could maybe extract touch DNA. And they were able to get a touch DNA profile. And somebody on the team realized that there were similarities in this case between another one that a man named Robert Napper had been convicted of, a few towns over, and he was already in Broadmoor, which is I think that's their central mental hospital for criminals. And so they found a match to his DNA from that touch DNA in the National DNA Database. But the thing about DNA, and I think this is really interesting when she goes into this, is that when you see on shows where they're like, we got a match to the DNA of this person, it's actually, there's a statistical chance that there's nobody else in the world that has that same DNA match, but it's actually not as conclusive as it seems. So they had to go find other evidence to try place him there. So they're able to go through his belongings. They found flakes of paint on Rachel's body that they were able to match to a toolbox that had just sat there in Broadmoor unclaimed after Robert was originally put away. They were able to match flakes of that paint to the paint on her body. And another thing they'd found was footprints on the scene that they'd taken plaster casts of, and they'd said, okay, well, it's a shoe size. I'm not sure what shoe size it was, but it was a smaller shoe size than what I think Robert Napper wore. But they discovered that because it was muddy, that when you walked in the mud and you pulled your foot up, it created a vacuum, which would have made the cast seem smaller. But they were able to recreate that. So they went out to Wimbledon Common, they recreated this, they pulled new casts and they matched those together. And they were like, okay, well, this actually does match a type of footwear that Robert Napper has. So they found all these different little pieces of evidence they were able to piece together. And they eventually were able to get a proper conviction. And then it transpired that Colin Stagg had nothing to do with it at all. But I just thought it was really fascinating. It was all these tiny little pieces that looked like this was the answer. And because they'd gone in completely the wrong direction, they may have never found that answer. They may have never got that answer for her family. They may have never got that answer just for the world at large who wanted to know what really happened to Rachel that day. I thought that was fascinating, that they were able to go in and just deconstruct the entire thing, not even having been there in the first place. I just thought that was absolutely fascinating.
It is completely fascinating. I mean, she talks a lot in the book as well about the infallibility of forensic science. And it's not that the forensic science is infallible. It's the context. It's the context of where that, it could match, but where did it come from? Who touched that before? There was one specific case where she was speaking about the killer, the victim's daughter's DNA was in the killer's shorts. And, there was a fingerprint underneath the hem of his shorts. And, the killer had said his son was wearing the shorts, but they found his wife's DNA in the groin of the shorts. So they were able to prove, well, it was you, it must have been you. And there's just all these little things. I suppose she has this whole chapter on, is it murder or is it suicide?
Yes.
And about that, I found that really fascinating as well. When she was talking about how, yes, it all might point one way, but it is down to, I suppose she talks about this as well, just because you can do one type of forensic science, it doesn't mean you can do all types of forensic science. It does come down to that kind of professional experience, which she has by the bucket load.
Yeah, because you can know what science is telling you, but you don't know the rest of the facts. And if you can't apply the facts of what you're finding to the facts of the case, that's going to create a disparity in what you're able to understand and your conclusions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And is this a book for you, I suppose, that sets it's set apart a little bit from other forensic science books that you've read? Like, why did you choose this over other ones?
I think it's partially the accessibility. I think it's if I'm feeling like because I write myself, I've written a fantasy mystery about 3 witches and a ghost in a cat costume who solve murder, and they have their own amateur forensic science lab. And when I was coming up with the concept of this, I started reading this book, and there's a section in the book where Angela talks about how if there are methods or there's information you want and there are no methods to get it, don't be afraid to invent your own tests. Mm-hmm. And I thought this was really useful for my witches who maybe want to invent magical forensic tests for magic that don't exist, because they don't exist. And it really spurred this idea that it was entirely possible to find answers to things that seem unanswerable. Mm-hmm. So I'm very fond of this book for this reason, because I read it first when I was coming up with this idea. I read it again, I think during the editing process, maybe 2 years ago. And then I read it again last week. And it's just really nice to see that it's such an easy read. It's so engaging. The case, like she doesn't sensationalize anything. The information is very useful. She's explaining it, but it's just such a clean way of learning how science works. And it's like the clean mind of the scientist. I think it's like this thing of just really factual and really useful information. And every time I read it, I get something new out of it.
Yeah, that's really good. I found that as well when I was reading it, that it was so accessible, and you're learning all this through, you could study forensic science and you could study this, that and the other, but to actually have the context and the stories around why she's doing it. And she did say something at the end of the book about how you only pass on about 10% of the knowledge you have. And I was like, if this is only 10% of her knowledge, I want to know the rest. Like, what else is going on in that brain? But at the end of the book, she was kind of talking as well about how she was kind of reflecting back, and she said one thing she wished she had got to do was look at the Madeleine McCann case. But if you could give Angela Gallop one case to look at, what one do you think it would be, and why?
Oh God, this is a very good question. And my brain has just gone, what are cases? Have you heard of any case? I think a very easy one would be the JonBenet Ramsey case, just because that's so ubiquitous in true crime spaces. It's such a horrible story, but also I would really, really love to know what her take on it was. Like, what would she do with all that evidence? What other evidence could she find if she was able to go back to that place and to investigate maybe and find things that other people hadn't? I think her take on it could be very interesting.
I can agree, because she did say, like, one of the main things I suppose about looking back at these cold cases is the preservation of evidence at the beginning. So as long as there's that, and we've seen it in so many cold cases now that are coming back through the courts, it's particularly with the case of Noel Long, who I covered for Beast, the murder of Nora Sheehan. We've seen that, they may not have had the technology and the way to do it back then, but the way that forensic science has developed over the years is now leading to all of these cold cases being able to be solved. So it's incredible that we have people like Angela Gallop who are able to share their knowledge with the world, and we can actually kind of understand how it all works, because I know you're a huge fan of CSI, and a lot of people, there's that CSI effect where people think, things are solved so fast. So it's great to have, I suppose, a real voice from that world, actually explaining it to laypersons, lay folk like ourselves, and I suppose a lot of people who are interested in true crime. But another thing she talked about, which I want to talk to you about, is she described in her book these incredible dinner parties she has. And it reminded me of something that you had shared on Threads a while ago. So she said that you're like, what did I write? She had written about these dinner parties where they act out, they write these like murder scenes and they act them out for entertainment. And very recently you shared that because you were a writer yourself, we'll talk a little bit about your book, but you shared that you had got your partner to basically help you stage a murder. Tell us
fictional murder. To be very clear, it's a fictional murder. So I am in the late stages of editing my second book, and I realized there was a kind of a minor murder, but still important, where I hadn't actually explained exactly what had happened to this particular victim. And I thought, okay, this is what I think happens. But then I was trying to describe what had happened. And I thought, okay, no, I'm not sure if you would be able to find that evidence. And my partner came along and I was like, I need to figure this out. So I got him to stand on the stairs and like act out what would happen if he was murdered in this specific way. And like, what kind of evidence would you leave behind? And how could I describe that? Which was a very nice and very useful way of it was like practical
Very
writing
practical.
where I was just like, okay, we're staging this. And then I was kind of saying, okay, I need to remember that for the next time. But as I'm writing something else secret at the moment, he was kind of like, that next time is now. So if you need me to stage more murders, please let me know. But it was very useful. And I think it's because I read books like these and also because I'm a fan of things like CSI, but that practical staging and understanding what kind of, like, that's the thing, like if I hadn't read these books or I hadn't watched those shows, I wouldn't really have any kind of understanding how this was going to work. And I think she's maybe inadvertently created a manual for me to be able to understand how I'm going to disseminate this information in a way that's if not entirely realistic, still plausible in my magical books.
Exactly. And she, I guess, obviously inspired you to do that, but how has this book in particular kind of inspired your own writing?
Yeah, so like as I was saying, the thing that she said at the end of the book about how don't be afraid to invent your own methods really, really struck a chord with me because I was still trying to figure out what I wanted to do within the book. Mm-hmm. So for the Undetectables, Mallory Hawthorne is kind of an amateur forensic scientist. She hasn't been able to go to college because she is chronically ill. She keeps taking gap years hoping she'll get better and it's not happening. But she has this interest in forensics and in the concept of solving crimes. And I thought it would be really interesting if, she had an extreme amateur interest and was able to access forensic machinery and she had somebody that maybe would teach her how to do this, and she could figure out ways to set up her own tests to discover different types of magic. So the murders are kind of they're undetectable in that there's no evidence being left behind, except there is. Kind of around the time of reading this, I was able to envision, okay, what if we had like a fingerprint database, but it was for spells? So like different spells that were known to people. And then what if we had a mass spectrometer and you could devise a test that would tell you what kind of magic was used. So if it was witch magic or troll magic or demon magic. And it was this really, really fun thing to me that I think is like specifically interesting to me. Everybody that read the book in terms of like my agent and editor were like, you need to calm down a little bit on the science. But I was like, but it's so interesting to me. But I just loved it. I loved this idea that I could add something from the real world into this magical world and that it would work. I think that was like the most exciting thing for me. And that was the main influence for me, was reading that like it was entirely possible to make up your own tests and for them to be plausible and testable. And it was a very joyous thing to realize this is a piece I was missing from the story. And I was able to slot that in there as I was reading.
Yeah. And there's you did suggest a second book to me, and I have to bring her up, Frances Glessner Lee. Another huge inspiration to you. It was only this morning when I was kind of putting my notes together, I Googled her and I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. I'll have to go and read the book about her now. She basically, because you have a character in your book who makes these magical dioramas. But tell us about Frances Glessner Lee, because I think she's also been a huge part of your writing and what they call her, the godmother of forensic science.
Yeah. So Frances Glessner Lee is absolutely fascinating to me as a person. There was so she basically invented these tiny doll houses that are used today for police to investigate crime scenes. This was in the 40s. So she's just an old rich lady. That's the most fascinating thing about her. She's an old rich lady who wanted to use her money for good. So she always wanted to go to Harvard. She wanted to be a doctor and she was told she couldn't do that. And there's this fantastic book called 18 Tiny Deaths by Bruce Goldfarb, which really goes into her life and her times. But she managed to kind of finagle her way into a very close personal relationship with the faculty in Harvard, set up a department of medical legal department, which is basically forensic science.
Mm-hmm.
Because she was really sick of the idea. What she was hearing from her doctor friends was that there were like thousands of murders every year going unsolved because doctors didn't know what to look for in terms of signs of murder. And also police didn't know how to actually investigate scenes. So what she did was she pulled together all these cases and took the actual case photos from scenes. And she built these like perfectly to scale dioramas. So there was 20 of them originally. There's only 18 surviving. And she had like a little story. So like this person, if there's one and it's a girl went out to buy meat, I think for dinner, and then went missing and was found in a house several down from where her own house was, and she's lying in the sitting room, and how did she get here? And it's like but they're not solvable. It's just they're asking you to look at the scenes and see what evidence is there in the scenes, and the detail in these things are absolutely incredible. This is just a passion project for her.
Yeah.
Just like, she literally was like, okay, I want people to learn how to do this properly. I'm going to devise a way to make this fun. So she'd made, I think, doll houses years ago for fun, like little scale models, and then thought, okay, well, I can probably do this in a very useful way. And then she got people to teach this at Harvard. And she's not talked about very much because she didn't want to be. She was like, well, this has nothing to do with me. So, so I don't want to be famous. And it was only really after she died that people started to realize how instrumental she had been in devising the current methods of investigation when it comes to actually looking at crime scenes and looking for evidence. I also think she inspired the first ever murder mystery, like the first ever crime film. They made up a film about a murder that happened at Harvard. I think Harvard were like, you can't call it the Harvard murder because that makes it sound bad. I think it's a murder on Mystery Street. It's something like to that effect. But she's just an absolutely fascinating woman in terms of her life. She was very interested. She'd just pick up an interest and run with it. Was kind of her, like how her children described her as well. But I just think it was a fantastic use of her money and her time, was to like really, really try to make a change in the world. And she actually successfully did. I think she was made an honorary captain then of the police. In Chicago, which is just like that a woman had never been a captain at that point. And like she'd never actually done any real police work as in on the ground, but they made her a captain because they were so impressed and like thrilled by the work that she'd done. She's absolutely a fascinating woman. But the dollhouses were an inspiration then for Diana, who's my character in the Undetectables, and she builds little crime scene dioramas, but she animates them so that you can see the characters moving around. Because the first time I saw these dollhouses, I was like, I need to put this in the book. I need to put this in a book somehow, but we're going to make it magical. And I based a character on Frances Glessner Lee. Her name is Francine Leon. Mostly because I didn't want to fictionalize a real person, but I did borrow from her history and made it so that Diana is like a massive fan of Francine Leon's work, but she's kind of improved upon it with magic that's at her disposal.
Of course. Why not improve a bit with magic? Yeah, that is a really interesting. Like when I Googled the images of it, I was like, is this in an exhibition somewhere? Like, can I go and see this? Apparently it was, but it doesn't seem to be anymore. I was like, damn. But like these are so detailed. And it's kind of like those people you see on TikTok that make like tiny houses with like little lollipop sticks and stuff like that. It's like, it's kind of that, but on like a murder scale. With
actual murder victims and blood and like it's incredible how she did this. Like I still don't really understand how, because the intricacy needed to make something that small.
Like the detail is really incredible. So tell us a little bit about, I suppose, the Undetectables and your process for writing about that. Have you had a background yourself in forensic science before you kind of came to not only Angela Gallop's book but your own writing?
So I have been obsessed with forensic science since I was about 8 years old. I took a course when I was maybe 8 or 9. It was like a week-long course on forensics and genetics, and it just blew my mind. I think ever since then I have been obsessed in a very amateur fashion, but I have been absolutely obsessed with forensic science ever since. And this must have been around the time that CSI was starting to blow up over here, because I hadn't heard of it because I was 9. But I think that was what made that course available to me. And kind of over the years, I have done forensic science courses, I've read forensic science books, and I've kind of been trying to teach myself as much as I possibly can, both because it's fascinating to me and also because it's useful in my writing. But yeah, the background very much came from, I just very very passionate about the concept of forensic science. And it took me years to realize that I could put that in books, that like nobody was going to tell me I couldn't do that. So that was like a fun realization that I could make a fantasy world and I could add in this thing that I'm passionate about. That was really where that came from, I think, was just a lifelong fascination with the concept of evidence and finding evidence and the little tests and things. There's something really soothing about the idea that answers are there. And I think that was always my thing, that answers are there.
Yeah, it's great. It's kind of like solving a puzzle. Like a lot of people who are interested in true crime have all these different reasons they're interested, and whether they're just obsessed with serial killers. Some people are in it for the gore. So, some people are in it for different reasons. But for me as well, it's definitely like that puzzle, like putting all the pieces together and figuring out. And like forensic science technically kind of is the puzzle science of all the sciences, of really putting everything together. So the Undetectables is out at the moment. You've also just, I believe, about to send in your second manuscript for your next book, which is a sequel. So tell us about that. How has that been, writing it, like from going from your debut novel into your second one?
It's been a lot. So it's my first time writing a book on contract, which is where everybody said, you have this amount of time to write the book and then we're going to pry it from your hands. So I think I started it last March. Wow. And it's about to go to copy edits now, provided everybody likes what I did with the last round of it. But it's been really interesting because it's a world that I know and the characters I know, but then there's like this added pressure of like, well, now I want people to like it and I want people to like the ideas that I had. But I always knew where the story was going. I knew what I was going to do in the sequel. And it's been great to know that the characters that I love, people's responses have been that they love them as well. So there's that kind of like lift in it that it's not really my own thing anymore, but it still is in the sense that I wrote it kind of quietly, most of it quietly before the first book came out. So I had that little gap where it was still mine.
Yeah.
But it's been a wild time, I think, is the main thing. It feels like it hasn't been very long. And like it has been forever since I started at the same time.
Yeah, it seems to have flown by. So I read your first book, obviously, absolutely loved it. And it is a very cozy mystery. So I read it when I was on a holiday. So I was in the sun floating in a pool. And like, I was just like, I want to be cold right now. I want to be in front of a fire. This is the wrong environment. So I cannot wait to reread it in the fall or in the autumn. And the second book as well. So tell us when the next book is out, what's it called, and where can people find it?
Yeah, so the sequel is called The Undead Complex. It's out September 24th, and you can currently, I think, pre-order it from Kenny's and from O'Mahony's. And there'll be a few more pre-order links coming up soon, but that's where you can get it now. It'll be in all good bookshops as well when it's out.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Courtney.
Thank you.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.